Jack Loeffler is an American oral historian, radio producer, writer, and environmentalist. He is known for his work documenting the culture and ecology of the American Southwest. He was Edward Abbey's best friend. I had the honor and privilege of interviewing him in his home in Durango, Colorado in December 2023. He was 87 years old at the time of this interview. This interview is comprised of 7 questions broken up into 11 parts into a single YouTube playlist. The full interview is also in the playlist, but will be released last. Jack is full of wisdom, and I did my best to let him speak freely without boundaries during our 3-hour conversation. Given this dynamic, Jack provided long, winding answers to my questions as he reflected back on his life. With that, let's get to the interview. Okay, my next question. What was your process in choosing to write your latest book, A Pagan Polemic, right?
Polemic.
Sorry about that. A Pagan Polemic. Reflections on nature, consciousness, and anarchism.
Well, many of the essays in this book have been previously published. At the time I put this book together, I did write some fresh stuff for it, I must say, but my wife was ill with a terminal disease, and I was her full-time caregiver, because she not only was my wife, but she was my super pal as well. And but I needed a project at the same time, and so this book was that project, and it gave me really a lot of time to reflect on the nature of my own life and the way I've seen things, and the fact that I've spent so much of my life in the presence of indigenous peoples all over the western United States and, well, actually as far south as Chiapas in Mexico, and befriended so many of them. They became lifelong friends and would open up to me when I'd conduct interviews with them, being an oral historian. I spell that A-U-R-A-L. I like it better because it's more realistic to me. But the upshot is, many of those people, the traditional peoples that I met who were indeed, they retained their sense of indigeneity. They were traditional, they maintained deep ties with their traditions, and subsequently their thinking was much more closely aligned with the relationship, a correct relationship of culture to habitat. And so I got deeply into thinking about a lot of the different things to put into this book. And I started going through essays that I'd written, dozens and dozens of essays that I'd already written. And I selected a bunch that I thought reflected the perspective that I wanted to reflect. And the title, A Pagan Polemic, my pal Gary Snyder was not keen on that name because the word pagan comes basically from a European paganistic perspective, pre-Christian, all of that. But I realized that I am rooted originally in European influence, and the paganism seems to come naturally to me, and it associates all so nicely with just about every traditional indigenous perspective that I've ever encountered. In other words, love of the earth, becoming totally what I think of as naturalized or naturized. And so that's where the pagan part of it came in. And then being something of a polemicist, somebody who runs counter to the cultural continuum, so to speak, was why the word polemic became a part of it. And not only that, it's nice alliteration. But I focus many of the essays that I've written focus on nature and the flow of nature, and how, to me, the most important thing we can do is daily go skinny dipping in the flow of nature, basically. And I've always been fascinated by the nature of consciousness and how do we perceive. And one of the things I talk about a lot in this book actually came from having first read an essay by Garrett Hardin entitled Tragedy of the Commons, which was first published in 1968. And in 1984, near Christmas time in 1984, the Abbeys and the Loefflers always went camping around the holiday season. And Ned and I were taking a hike one day, and he said, "Have you ever read anything by Garrett Hardin?" And I said, "Yeah, The Tragedy of the Commons." And he gave me an essay that he had just read, that Hardin had just published in Scientific American, titled An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament, which I snapped to instantly.
Let me slow down real quick and just speak to Tragedy of the Commons, because and give a little more context on that, in case folks watching this haven't read it. Going off my memory, I read it. It had a big impact on me. I read it in an environmental policy class, let's just say 15 years ago, a little more. And his thesis is that if there's a common area, the humans will overtake it in a way that makes it so that that landscape is no longer viable, and that's the tragedy. He has an essay that speaks to that much more eloquently than I just laid out, but I feel like that's the nuts and bolts of it. But it sets the stage for the separation between, anthropocentric thinking, just thinking, okay, what's best for me, and more ecocentric thinking, what's best for the environment, and
exactly.
how can I be a part of that. And without that framework, it's hard to have these kind of discussions or do this type of work.
Well, I read The Ecolate View of the Human Predicament in Ed's Scientific American. And it turned out that a couple of weeks later, my wife and my daughter and I found ourselves in 1984 out in Santa Barbara. And I knew that's where he had taught. And so I looked him up in the phone book, and he was there. And of course, I always traveled with the recording equipment.
Right.
I'm going to cough, excuse me.
No, you're fine.
Okay, boys, come back. Excuse me. This could be tricky.
Yeah, we can cut that piece out. So the power of editing, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I know. It's good stuff. Anyway, I called him up, and he answered the phone. And I said, "My name is Jack Loeffler. I'm a friend of Ed Abbey, whom you've been in contact with." Ed and Garrett had corresponded frequently. They were part of a fan club, a mutual fan club. And I said, "I'd like to conduct an interview with you if you're amenable." And he said, "That's fine." And I said, "When?" And he said, "Now." And so I found myself driving from Santa Barbara to Goleta, which is where he lived, which is right there where UC Santa Barbara is. And I was driving with one hand and speed reading An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament with the other.
Brush up on it.
Whew. And I got there safely. I didn't kill anybody. And I set up and got a beautiful interview with Garrett Hardin. And he really described, first of all, I asked him to convey the basic concept that he wanted to develop in The Tragedy of the Commons. And the way he put it to me was that in England of 200 or 300 years ago, there was a common area of grassland, and the people who lived around it were using it as a common pasture land. And indeed, it became evident that putting too many more cattle on it was going to kill the pasture land. But they did anyway, and indeed that commons was no longer capable of supporting anything. And according to Hardin, the tragedy of the commons was they knew it was going to happen, but they did it anyway. And that's in his own words, which I recorded. That entire interview is in an early book I did called Headed Upstream, Interviews with Iconoclasts. And matter of fact, I've got that whole recording. I can give you some of the quotes in there. Another thing that he came up with on that interview, come to think of it, was he quoted William Ophuls, who's still around as far as I know, whom he had great respect for personally. Hardin did. But the quote is, "Nature abhors a maximum." In other words, if you maximize your extraction of natural resources to fulfill growth for the sake of growth, you will have minimized the habitat to the extent that it will. In other words, it was the same trip. The tragedy of the commons. And I really liked Garrett Hardin. He became a friend. When I'd go through Santa Barbara to visit in-laws, I would take strawberries or something out and we'd shoot the breeze. But he was paralyzed from the waist down. He'd had polio. And but I really enjoyed talking to him. His brain just was amazing.
Yeah. He's a deep thinker and really a profound environmental writer.
I've forgotten the question, by the way.
Well, his philosophy just really set the stage.
Yeah. Where I wanted to go with that is that I see the entire planet as a commons. And it's an integrated system, and it's, to me, a living organism. And apropos of that, when I was speaking with Wes Jackson some years ago, Wes Jackson is another brilliant guy. He started the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and a brilliant ecologist. He really is. But I told him that I considered the planet a living organism. And he says, well, it fails in one respect, and that is that it can't reproduce itself. And living organisms are capable of reproduction, self-reproduction. And I said, yeah, but that's a human definition.
Right.
You know, and so we have to take that in.
More philosophical.
Yeah, and subsequently I've read stuff by people like Fritjof Capra. His book, it's over there, and I can't remember the name of it right now. And then the work of Lynn Margulis, whose work with symbiosis is just so brilliant to me. And she's gone now. Fritjof is still around. I interviewed him, but the upshot is that trying to put the whole thing together, I finally realized that human consciousness is itself a commons, and so that's why I included the whole thinking about consciousness in this book. And then I got to thinking about anarchism. Both Ed Abbey and Gary Snyder, and myself and others are anarchists. I'm very much a benign one. I do not intend to ever hurt anybody over any subject except self-defense or defense of family. But
Right.
The upshot is that I feel that governance from the top down is dead wrong. It's got to come from the grassroots and come up. And it has to be, in other words, governance should be by consensus within small communities. And so I was thinking about, to me, what reflects an obvious biotic community is an ecosystem like a watershed. And so my thought with regard to governance and all of that has to do with looking at watersheds as John Wesley Powell did back in the latter part of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
He influenced me big time. But the upshot is that if grassroots governance from within the watersheds, rather than the geopolitically bounded states that we have, came to prevail, that would make a lot more sense. This does not mean that there shouldn't be some form of different levels of governance. Subsequently, my daughter Peregrina and I interviewed a lady named Eleanor Ostrom back in 2010, who'd recently gotten the Nobel Prize for her book, Governing the Commons. Yeah. She, by the way, took some umbrage with Garrett Hardin because never in any of his writing did he bring up the word trust or mutual cooperation, which was interesting to me. And that brought up something else to me because my great anarchist thinker to me remains Peter Kropotkin, who was also, the term hadn't been coined yet, but a dynamite biogeographer. He really was. I mean, he was a huge scientist, a fantastic scientist, but he was also a committed anarchist, and his particular thinking was formulated before the human population actually reached 1 billion. And he was thinking about people being the difference between the governing bodies and the serfs who served the governing bodies, the slaves, the people in the fields who produced for the,
Our lords and peasants. Sorry.
Exactly. And so that's where he came from. And then it was easy to just transpose that thinking into thinking about not just people, but the planet should sit at the table of any governing body. The point of view of the planet is interpreted by people who are well enough educated to the needs of the planet to speak in its behalf relative to individual watersheds, because each watershed has its own needs. And watershed consciousness has become terrifically important to me. And so that's how I got to the title of the book, A Pagan Polemic, Reflections on Nature, Consciousness, and Anarchism, because it all fits together, at least in my head.
Puts those puzzle pieces together. That's great.